Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here. What an honor to follow Charlotte and Sonia on the stage and to see all of you there smiling up at me from the audience. I'm going to talk to you today about my journey, my 1,100-mile walk on the Pacific Crest Trail being one of the prime journeys, but really, I think more importantly, about the bigger journey, of which that hike was only a part, the journey that I have been on to become the writer I am and the woman I am too. As a writer, of course, thinking all the time about language and considering what words mean very carefully. And one thing that I've discovered over and over again is how often those words that we use all the time, we think we know their meaning. And then when I look deeper into their origins, into their roots and sources, I find that they mean even more, that they can be used for greater power in some ways. And so I thought I'd start the story of my journey really at my own root, my own source. As it happens, it began here in Pennsylvania. This is my first time speaking in Pennsylvania, but I was born here. I was born in Cambria County. My parents had gotten married 3 years before. They were just out of high school. They married because my mother was pregnant with my older sister. And they had a marriage that wasn't a happy one. My father was abusive, and I spent my first 5 years of my life here in Pennsylvania in a really difficult atmosphere, one of a lot of fear and violence. When I was about 6 years old, we moved to Minnesota, to a little town outside of Minneapolis, and it was there that my mother, who was by then the mother of my brother as well, I have 3 children, found the strength and courage to leave my father. And so began really the second chapter of my childhood, which I spent in this little town outside of Minneapolis, the daughter of a single mother who worked in a factory, and she worked as a waitress. And things were difficult, but also happy. We had in some ways escaped really the things that would ultimately have defined me if she had stayed married to my father. The third chapter of my childhood began when I was about 11 or 12. By then, my mother had married the man who became my stepfather, a very good man. And together with our family and a menagerie of animals, we moved up to northern Minnesota, to rural Aiken County, where we lived back to the land style on 40 acres of wilderness. We didn't have electricity or indoor plumbing or running water. We built our own house. It wasn't my idea of a good time. I was a teenager. I didn't like having to, wash my hair in a bucket that was heated up over a wood stove. I really thought that I, was worthy of a more glamorous way of life at the age of 15. But my mother would always say to me, "Cheryl, someday you're going to thank me for this." And I couldn't have known it then, but she was right. There were 3 things that were true throughout my whole childhood. One is that we were always poor. We always struggled financially. The other is that we were always happy. We always felt rich in love. My mother would always say, "We aren't poor because we're rich in love." She was the kind of woman who made life good. She loved my siblings and I the way that you hope a mother will. And in so many ways, I think that was the prime nutrient of my life, that love she gave me. And I hope everyone in this room has been loved that way by someone, because it's a life-altering experience. And the third thing that was true is that I always wanted to be a writer. Words were my passion. When I first learned how to read and write, it was as if the world cracked open in a way that I had never experienced before, and it continued to crack open as I was exposed more and more to literature. I had no idea that someone like me could be a writer. So I had that fire within me, but I didn't know any writers, and I was growing up basically among poor country people. I had no way to sort of imagine the path that I would have to take to this place here today. So I knew that the beginning of that path, however, might be college. So I applied to college. Nobody talked to me about applying to college. I didn't know that you actually researched it and applied to many schools and made decisions about where to go. What I did is I got all these brochures in the mail, and I looked at the pictures on the front of them, and the one that looked the best was the one I applied to. I applied to one. Thankfully, I got in. And with the acceptance letter, it said, your parents can take classes for free. That's one of the benefits of going to school here. It was at a private Catholic university in St. Paul, Minnesota, called the University of St. Thomas. And so when I read that letter, my mom said, I've always wanted to go to college. And we knew at first, I thought she was joking, because she was 40, which we all know is way too old to go to college. Or so I thought when I was 17. But after a while, we talked about it, and I really, my mother really was my hero, and I was aware how much she'd sacrificed to raise me and my siblings. And so what became a joke, what started as a joke became a plan, and that was my mother went to college with me, which is the last thing on this earth I wanted. We had a rule that on campus, she could not acknowledge me unless I acknowledged her. And being the 17-year-old that I was, and 17 and 18, I would often see her and just sail on by, too cool to say hi, Mom. And other times I would talk to her. And what happened over the course of that year was that I started to see my mom in a new light. She went to school and got straight A's and succeeded. And I did too. The world opened up to me. That school wasn't a good fit. I was paying my own way through college, and it was a private school, and most of the people at that school were majoring in business, and I was this aspiring writer. So I decided to transfer, and I spoke to my mother about it, and we both decided that we would transfer. My mother was commuting 3 hours each way to college from northern Minnesota. And so she said, well, I'll transfer to the University of Minnesota in Duluth, which was only an hour and a half from our house. And I went to the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. And on we went, sailing through college. In our senior year, my mother, who was by then 45, got what she thought was a bad cold that wouldn't go away, which, wasn't so out of the ordinary. But soon she found that indeed what she had was lung cancer, end-stage lung cancer. She died 7 weeks later, very suddenly. She died on the Monday of our spring break of our senior year, and on the Friday of that spring break, we had her memorial service. And the next Monday, I went back to school. My mom was 2 classes shy of earning her bachelor's degree. I was 5 classes shy. And I had promised my mother that I would finish my college education, even though when she was dying, I didn't want to. I wanted that world. Essentially the world fell apart for me when my mom died. I remember the day she died in a hospital in Duluth, and I was with her body, and when I left her, I went into the bathroom, the little bathroom off of her room, and I saw myself. I looked at myself in the mirror, and it was as if I was seeing myself for the first time, because in so many ways I was seeing the new person that I was in the world without my mother. And those of you in the room who've lost somebody who was really essential to you know what I'm talking about, that the world ends when that person does, and we have to figure out who it is that we can be again in the world. And so began that journey. I pushed my way through that last semester. I did everything except finish 1 paper in 1 class. And so in the end, I didn't get my degree. It would take me 7 more years to do that. But I forged ahead, and I tried in my grief really to fill that hole my mom had left. I tried to keep my family strong. I tried to keep us essentially moving forward without her the same way we had been with her. And that was impossible. I failed at that. The hole my mother left was too big. And my family scattered and disintegrated. And I moved into my 20s doing the work of that we all do in our 20s. Trying to figure out who I was, trying to write. I was married. I had gotten married really young to a good man. And what ultimately happened after my mom had been dead a couple of years is I spiraled into, I had been grieving sort of well and constructively. And then I finally everything fell apart. And I raged against my sorrow in ways that were really awful for me. did all sorts of things you're not supposed to do when you're married to someone. I became very promiscuous and deceitful, and I got involved with a man who was involved with heroin, and I got involved with heroin too. And it was really there at that bottom moment that I guess this journey on the Pacific Crest Trail began. It was December 1994, and I was standing in line at an REI outside of Minneapolis. For those of you who don't know what REI is, it's an outdoor store. And there had been a blizzard. As somebody who writes personal stories from my life, I can tell you that so often what happens is life just hands us those metaphors. And in this case, this was certainly true. There had been a blizzard and I needed to dig my truck out. So I went to REI to buy a shovel. And I really needed to dig myself out too. I was buried. And I was standing in line waiting to pay for this little foldable shovel that I was needed. And I looked to the side and there was this row of books near the cash register. And just to kill time, I took one off the shelf and read the back. The book was called The Pacific Crest Trail, Volume 1, California. And it told the story of this national scenic trail that goes from Mexico to Canada through California, Oregon, and Washington, up the crest of the Sierra Nevada and the Cascade Range. And I had never heard of that trail. I'd never heard of any national scenic trail. I'd never heard of the Appalachian Trail or anything. But there was something about that when I just read those couple of paragraphs about that trail, which was so clearly significant and beautiful and magnificent and big. I knew that I was none of those things. And I knew that I had to attach myself to something that was, or I was never going to do what I needed to do with my life. And that is just quite simply to become the person that my mother had raised me to be. And that ultimately that was the way that I was going to live in that world without her, is by honoring her. So what I did is I was working as a waitress at the time and writing. And I doubled up my shifts and I saved my tips. And every week I would go to REI and I would say, I'm going to go hike this trail. I didn't have enough time to hike the whole trail. It takes about 5 or 6 months to hike the whole trail. But I decided I'd go out about 100 days, about 3 months. And so every week I would go to REI and say, okay, I need stuff to take this big backpacking trip. And they're super good at selling new stuff, REI. And so I got a divorce and I shut down my life in Minneapolis and I loaded all this stuff, these boxes, these resupply boxes that I would mail myself along the way, and I loaded up all these things and I drove to Portland, Oregon, where I now live. And I flew to Los Angeles and I got myself to this little town of Mojave, California. The trail was about 10 miles away, and that's where I would begin my hike the next day. I piled everything that I'd purchased on the bed. I'd never packed my backpack, even though everyone at REI had told me I should. There was this mountain of stuff on the bed, and it was all the stuff I had to carry. And I put it all in this pack, and I found that I couldn't. It didn't all fit. And then I strapped everything else to the outside of the pack. And then as I was doing this, as I was loading up all this stuff, I sort of remembered that I'd never gone backpacking before. So Wild, my book Wild, in which I write about this journey, it's not a how-to guide. I've had some people write to me and say that they bought the book looking for advice. It's more like what not to do. But I'd done a lot of hiking, so I thought, well, you know, I'll be okay. So I pack all this stuff up and I try to lift my pack, and what happens is I can't lift it. I can't lift it even a little tiny bit. And the problem is I have to lift it. And I'm sitting there looking at this pack and I'm struggling with it and I'm trying to do everything I can to get it lifted. And I realize that, you know, that's the only thing that I have left, is my determination that I will lift that pack and that I will carry it over those 1,100 miles. And I think that really that's what Wild is about. It's the story of how I bore this weight that I literally could not bear, that, you know, this pack that I couldn't lift in an air-conditioned motel room was going to be the pack that I was going to carry over 1,100 miles of wilderness terrain, up and down mountains and through deserts and all of that stuff. But really it's about how I came to grips with bearing the unbearable in my life. And I know everyone in this room has either had that experienced before or you're going to. We all have to bear what we can't bear at various points in our lives. And sometimes that weight is monumental. And we always have two choices. It's you don't do it or you do it. And so the only choice that seemed available to me at that moment was to do it. So I got the pack strapped to my back, and I walked onto the trail. And it turned out to be not a lot like hiking, actually. I sort of thought, backpacking would be like a lot of day hikes sort of smashed together. But then I realized that, on a day hike, you wake up in your bed, you go have like a big brunch or something because you're going to go for a big hike. You go do your walk, and then you go to the pub and have a burger and a Chardonnay and go back to your bed. Backpacking is not that. Backpacking is carrying everything you need on your back and sleeping in the dirt and waking up and walking and sleeping in the dirt again. And I was essentially schooled pretty quickly, like within the first hour of my experience on the PCT. I didn't see another human being for the first 8 days of my hike. I didn't bring the right kind of gas in my stove, so I couldn't cook the dehydrated food I'd brought with me. I couldn't stand up beneath that too heavy pack, and everywhere it made contact with me, I was chafing my body and blistering me. My feet were killing me as well. I had essentially done everything wrong. I'd made a lot of mistakes, but the one thing that I kept doing, that I kept leaning into, is that I was doing one thing right. And that was I was moving forward, and I was always taking the next step. And sometimes what happened is that next step was so painful to take that it was the only thing I could keep faith in. I could only go. I would count my steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that was what I held on to. And so what started to happen over those 100 days is I started to accept. I went out there thinking, I guess, that I was going to have this big spiritual journey, that I was going to be, thinking about my mother and reflecting on my life over sunsets. And while I did that, certainly, the most important thing I did is that I put one foot in front of the other. And I was cast into the physical realm. I had to go through a physical rite of passage that forced me to find my own strength, my own resilience, to accept what was uncomfortable, to accept what was scary. I think that the number one question I got about hiking on this trail myself was, were you afraid? And the answer is yes and no. I think that fearlessness, like Charlotte said earlier, is really part of all of the journeys we take. And I think fearlessness doesn't mean being without fear. It means getting comfortable with being afraid. It means doing the work you need to do, which almost always the most important work we do is outside the comfort zone. And so that's what I became really intimately acquainted with on my hike on the PCT. I finished my hike on September 15th, 1995. I was 2 days before my 27th birthday at the Columbia River, which forms the border between Oregon and Washington. I had begun my hike down in the Mojave Desert of Southern California. And, I think a lot of times when we think about stories of transformation, I guess the culture has made that journey narrative a very black and white one. So as if, like I began that hike and I was Charles Manson, and then I ended it and I was the Buddha. And that's not the case. And in Wild, I really wanted to tell the true story of that transformative experience I had, which was so much more subtle and internal and discreet. And I do think that that's how we in our lives change and transform ourselves. It's not okay that my mom's dead. It's not okay that she lost her life when she was 45. It won't ever be. But I have come to accept that that's what it was, and accept that I could thrive in the face of that. And I think that in so many ways that experience on the PCT, in which I had to do that every hour, and in some ways in every step, put me in touch with that in a really deep way. It also greatly informed my ability to go on and become a writer. the arts, anyone who works in the arts knows that, success is measured very differently in my field than it is in a lot of other fields. It's not, so often success in the arts looks to others like failure. For years, I was a serious writer, taking my work, putting it always at the forefront of my life, deeply giving myself over to apprenticing myself to the writer's craft. But at parties and gatherings of people, they'd say, well, what are you doing? Yeah, I'm a waitress. I'm a waitress. That's how I earn my money. And what I'm really doing is writing. What have you published? Not much. But what I was really doing is actually building my career, essentially. And everything about doing that in the arts has to do with keeping faith in the step, with going down to that small scale, with taking risks. Nobody's going to walk up to you and say, I really want you to write me a short story, and I'll pay you $30,000 for it. And so what you have to do is you have to do it anyway. You have to not let money or fame or external approval be the engine of your success. You have to let your passion be that engine. And so that's what I did all those years, and which led me here. I've now written 3 books, and it's been the most extraordinary year. It's been such an experience to have my book Wild really find an audience beyond that I ever imagined. My cell phone rang. I mean, first of all, just Wild came out into the world before Oprah called me. It was on the New York Times bestseller list, and had reached an audience that absolutely blew me away. But once Oprah called, which was really a singular experience, and she brought that book to her audience, it was like Wild was sort of served this shot of, triple shot of espresso, and it went to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. And a lot of people have said to me, now that you have a book that, is #1, you can write whatever you want to write for the rest of your life. How does that feel? They've said. And my response has always been, really, because that's exactly what I was going to do anyway. I was going to write whatever I wanted to write. And that's what I did when I wrote Wild and Tiny Beautiful Things and Torch. I didn't try to write a bestseller. You can't try to write a bestseller. What you can try to do is the best you can do. And that's what I've always kept faith with, is writing that best book I could write. And I think when people say that, when people hear me say that, they sometimes misinterpret that and think that it means I'm not ambitious. I'm very ambitious. But where I have always put my ambitions is in the place that I actually have some power, and that is doing my best work. And what happens with our best work in the world isn't really up to us. And so I guess I will leave on that note. There's a quote in Wild from Abraham Lincoln, and he says, "I'm a slow walker, but I never walk back." And I was so profoundly touched by that, because it's something I think is a very common human experience when we all think about how, in whatever direction we're reaching to have our success as parents, as partners, as professionals, as humans, as citizens, neighbors, community members, is how do I move forward and not dwell on those things that have kept me in the back. And I think that how we move forward is slowly acknowledging that we're going to make mistakes, acknowledging that sometimes what we have to move forward carrying is too heavy, but that we can do it, and that we can keep faith with that practice of continuing to walk. Thank you so much.